So good morning, everyone. Let's start with, today we're going to do just the initial praise to Shakyamuni Buddha on page 5, this single verse. We'll do that 3 times. Then we'll do mandala offering and refuge and bodhicitta. I think we'll just shorten it a little bit so we have a bit more teaching time. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. And go forward to page 16. We'll do the brief mandala prayer at the bottom of that page, and then the offering mantra, the Idam Guru, and then go on to refuge. O Saji Poki Juk Shing Me Tok Traham Ri Rab Ling Ji Ni De Gyan Padi Sangye Jing Du Mihte Uwaryi Dokunam Dakshing La Chopasho Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. Then turn the page to 2021. We'll do the English version first once, and then the Tibetan twice. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chunyan Gipe Sonam Gi Dola Penshir Sangye Drupar Sho Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chunyan Gipe Sonam Gi Dola Penshir Sangye Drupar Sho. Okay, let's do a short meditation to refresh our motivation for today's sessions. And just spend a few minutes in focused meditation on the breath, whatever way is suitable for your mind. If you have a particular technique you use, just use that. Otherwise, again, you can tune into the sensation that occurs at the tip of the nose, where we feel the air coming in and out of the nostrils, making that your meditation object. Just try to stay present with the breath. And of course, in any meditation on the breath, the goal is to maintain that single-pointed concentration, but to be vigilant so that when the mind wanders away, we notice that and then return back to the breath, reestablish our mindfulness of the breath once more. So let's do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation. So to set our motivation, I'm going to start with a quote from the commentary by Geshe Ngawang Dargye. He says, "The Kadampa Lamas say that mind training is the treasure of all attainments. If we never try to train our mind, it will be oversensitive, too easily swayed in joy, and too easily depressed. The slightest change can be overwhelming if we are without mind training. However, if we are familiar with it, we can, when harm befalls us, meditate that suffering is the nature of cyclic existence and remain undisturbed." So we've been working with this idea, particularly in the last day when we went through a number of these scenarios, the ways in which suffering manifests in our lives, the difficulties, the problems. If we have this jewel of mind training, then we can have a proper perspective to recognize that this is the product of our own karma, that karma is arising from our delusions, specifically this deluded mind of self-cherishing, when we have it accompanied by our self-grasping, these twin demons. When these are manifesting in our minds, we only pay attention to ourselves, we neglect the welfare of others, and we engage in unskillful actions that lead to this suffering. So mind training is to help us to understand the true causes of our suffering, so that we can not just be intent upon removing that for ourselves, but so that we can also open our hearts to the suffering of others. To understand that all beings are being misled by these twin demons in the same way that we ourselves are. But unlike us, most of these beings don't have this jewel of mind training, don't have access to these teachings, don't have the karma to receive these teachings and practice them. So there's a certain level of responsibility and obligation that comes with learning about mind training. For us to practice it ourselves, but for us to do that with the intention to help others to know these same techniques, to be able to unravel what is going on in their lives, know the causes of it, and then abolish those causes to annihilate these twin demons. So this is our motivation of bodhicitta, why we engage in this study of mind training, is so that we can be of the greatest benefit to others by fully developing our own qualities, removing all of our own negative tendencies, achieving the state of Buddhahood. For in that state we then can skillfully, capably guide beings to doing the same work. So hold that motivation deeply in your heart for today, even beyond this weekend, throughout this life, and all the way through to enlightenment. Okay, let's open our eyes fully and we'll begin, or continue. So again, just a little housekeeping. I did send the files to Amelia, and she has forwarded them on to the people who had given their email addresses. So if you needed to get the files and didn't get a chance to do that, maybe Amelia here, just give her your email address and she'll be happy to send those along. I just wanted to make sure those of you who did get some files from Mike, you did get the commentary that I've been referring to occasionally that by Geshe Jampa Gyatso? Okay, just wanted to make sure because I realized that I didn't actually send that to Mike, but I mentioned it to him in my email, and I just wanted to make sure that he did forward it on to everyone. Okay, so again, towards the end of yesterday, we were looking at this chart. And this chart I went through yesterday in terms of these sort of two tracks, the twin demons that we're combating in our mind training techniques are in that third column, the self-centered attitude or self-cherishing, as we frequently call it. And then the self-grasping ignorance. So again, we haven't talked as much about the second of these because the whole first section of the text is really about conventional bodhicitta, which is the antidote to that self-centered attitude. Our wish to benefit others, to cherish them, to hold them dear. This is what combats that self-centeredness that we have. Whereas self-grasping we'll talk about towards the end in the last few verses, and that's where we combat that with the wisdom realizing emptiness, particularly emptiness of the person, the self, but also the emptiness of all phenomena. So let's go. Were there any questions on this chart? I realize I'm not going to go back through it all. I just don't have the time. I apologize for those of you who weren't here. Let's go ahead then to verse 51 and read this together. O king of the knowledge mantras that torment the enemy, the cruel one called the insidious demon of self-grasping runs uncontrollably in the jungle of cyclic existence, brandishing the sharp weapon of actions. Summon this pledge breaker who brings about my own and others' ruin. So this, again, in the previous verse, we were talking about kind of invoking Yamantaka to do all of this, heavy-duty work of annihilating these twin demons and so on, particularly the mind of self-cherishing. Now, again, we're talking about a similar type of idea, just as Geshe-la says, just as there are many knowledge mantras that torment enemies through the rituals of mantra, to cherish others through neglecting ourselves is the king of the knowledge mantras that destroys the enemy, self-cherishing. So once more, I mean, when we use this idea of like Yamantaka and kind of invoking this external being, in a sense, to do this work, well, the external being isn't going to annihilate our self-cherishing and isn't going to destroy our self-grasping. This is what we have to do ourselves. So in a sense, we're trying to invoke our own power, our own ability to kind of put our needs and our focus on ourselves to the wayside and learn to cherish others, learn to hold them as the most important. So this is kind of, again, where we use this idea of something that is outside of ourselves, sort of the king of knowledge mantras, but it's really referring to the king of attitudes that we have to have within ourselves, the mind that cherishes others, which will actually help us to overcome that demon of self-cherishing. So this is what is tormented by this king of cherishing others, which is, again, why knowledge mantras is used, is just because there's very powerful mantras that can be used. Well, this is the most powerful way to combat the self-cherishing mind. That enemy is through the force of cherishing others. So in the next line, the cruel one called the insidious demon of self-grasping. As I said, you're going to see self-grasping and self-cherishing kind of taking different turns being the object of this. But we're mostly focusing on self-cherishing through this first part of the text. But obviously, like I said, these two come together frequently in our minds. We went through an investigation in the first day about what is the nature of each of those minds and what is their relationship. But frequently, we have them both arising. You know, we're grasping strongly to a sense of self that we believe is real, and on the basis of that, we are cherishing that self. And so anytime that one is referred to, in a sense, we could say the other is, though there will be more specific verses where we target each of them individually, obviously. And we've seen some of those already previously. But the mind of self-grasping is the deeper root, is the deeper error that we're making. So here, this is the cruel one that's called this insidious demon of self-grasping that runs uncontrollably in samsara, in the jungle of cyclic existence, brandishing the sharp weapon of actions. This is what we looked at in that whole collection of verses, all the various actions that we have done, motivated at the deepest level through our self-grasping, but also, of course, through this self-cherishing mind that doesn't think about others and thereby is harming them and harming ourselves, sending out that sharp weapon that comes back to cut our own happiness. So again, they're both involved and both targets of mind training. It's just, again, they come to the forefront here and there. Geshe Jampa Gyatso says the insidious demon of self-grasping, which is like that, is the two that are the root of our own and others' ruin. The self-grasping that apprehends the self, that is abandoned by the hearers and solitary realizers, of course, as well as the bodhisattvas, and especially the cruel, insidious demon of self-cherishing. So even though one is mentioned, we always are going to be kind of implying the second one, the other demon. So, summon this pledge breaker who brings about my own and others' ruin. You know, this is what causes us to break our pledges, to be, you know, have our commitments and vows degenerate. It causes our behavior to degenerate. You know, both of these minds are operative. So, you know, we want to, you know, kind of bring forward the enemy that we're now going to, you know, execute. We're going to annihilate. So this is getting us ready for these verses where we're going to keep summoning Yamantaka to keep, you know, annihilating time after time the problems that we have on the basis of these two states of mind by ridding ourselves of the states of mind themselves. So let's go on to the next verse. Summon it, wrathful Yamantaka. Strike it, pierce the heart of the enemy and the self. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin. To the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So there's going to be, you see that there's a repetition of these at the beginning of each line. Summon it, strike it, and so, and then, well, there's the rant and rave, which I'll talk about shortly, but we're going to see a repetition that follows into the next few verses where a single syllable will be repeated twice or a phrase will be repeated twice. This is because we have once more kind of two targets and two antidotes, two things that we're trying to cultivate. In the mind training text, as we said, we've got conventional bodhicitta, which is our wish to become a Buddha for the sake of others, which is imbued with cherishing others, that antidotal mind. Whereas the other, mind that we need to cultivate to counteract the demon of self-grasping is the wisdom realizing selflessness, emptiness. So this is invoked in the first time in relation to the conventional, meaning particularly the conventional bodhicitta that we need to have, as well as the second time from the point of view of the ultimate. So anytime that you see that repetition, it's referring to these two different aspects of our mind training practice. So we're kind of, again, summoning Yamantaka, who, as we said, represents both of those embodied in that form. But as I just mentioned, it's so that we can have these in our own minds. It's not that some being outside of ourselves is going to get rid of these demons for us. We have to do the work ourselves. Strike it, same type of idea. Pierce the heart of the enemy and the self. So when we talk about the heart of the enemy, this is going to be coming up in the very last line too, right? To the hearts of the enemy. We have a real specific way that we're talking about that, is kind of to really get at the way in which those states of mind are observing the self, their mode of apprehension of the self. So this is coming up in a slide. Let's go to the next slide, where I think I've got something in particular on this refrain that we are going to be seeing. We've got a few more verses till we get to 55. But the whole collection of verses that I'm going to try to skirt through at least somewhat quickly this morning, from 55 through 90, you have this refrain that's going to happen again and again. This ranting and raving on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, which again can be referring to self-grasping or self-cherishing, but essentially we're talking about both of them. There might be an individual one that is being isolated, but they're coming together in our minds frequently, so we target them both. And then again, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So let's go to the next slide. We'll look at a little bit more about what this is, some commentary on this from Geshe Jampa Gyatso. He said, because self-cherishing brings about our own and others' ruin, we ask Yamantaka to stomp angrily on the head of this bad conception. Again, so while we can say self-cherishing is the main conception that is targeted so far in this text, we would have no problem including self-grasping in this as well. This idea of ranting and raving, there's different translations of this. I think in Thupten Jinpa's it's dance and trample. In Geshe Sopa's translation, it's roar and thunder. But you have just this idea that you're going to do all this wild stuff to just, to completely annihilate it, these radical states of mind. Because if you think about it, both of these, whether we talk about the wisdom realizing emptiness or the mind cherishing others, are quite radical. They're quite outside of what we are habitually thinking. They're kind of turning everything around, whereas, we're so habituated to holding ourselves as primary and most important and following after that self that we cherish so dearly. We're going to completely reverse that attitude, which, as we see in the world, is not how most beings live their lives. So, this is a radical way of training and transforming our thoughts. And then, of course, the wisdom realizing emptiness is the most kind of the deepest way in which the Buddha taught that we need to change our minds. So it's quite radical thinking in that regard too, to not cling to any idea of a self that is in any way substantial or inherent, to recognize the very subtle way that things exist, that the I exists and so on, which we'll talk about when we get to those verses. So this is, go on to the next one. So we say to the hearts, this is what I was alluding to earlier. The heart here refers to what are called, this is a term that comes from sort of the study of the mind from Lowrick, the mode of apprehension of self-grasping and the mode of apprehension of self-cherishing. So what do we mean by that? We mean the way in which the self is apprehended by these two different states of mind. So there is a conventional self that exists. As I mentioned, I think the first day, the word self gets used so often in Buddhism, but sometimes we refer to the self that does exist, that's conventionally existent, but sometimes we are referring to the fictitious sense of self that we are adhering to, and that's particular when we talk about self-grasping. So the mode of apprehension of self-cherishing is where we take that self that does exist, because you do exist, we all exist, in a very subtle way, and we cherish it. We hold it most dear. We neglect the welfare of others on the basis of that self-centeredness, that self-preoccupation. That is the mode of apprehending the self in that way. It's kind of the way in which it is viewed and thought about, the way in which it's apprehended. Whereas self-grasping has a different mode of apprehension. It is apprehending a self that exists only through designation, through imputation, and it is holding it to be inherently existent, holding it to be truly existent, real, as Rinpoche often says, to give it a level of reality that it doesn't have. So when we talk about these different modes of apprehension, this is the heart. This is what we're trying to get to, is to destroy their own mode of apprehension, the way in which each of these minds is observing the self. And as I said, they frequently come together because when the ignorance of self-grasping is present, and then we cherish the self, well then we're apprehending a truly existent self, an inherently existent self, and holding that dear. So they can be there together. This is because this deeper error of self-grasping is with all of the deluded states, is with all of our afflicted minds. Now again, as we saw the first day, the mind of self-cherishing, His Holiness says at the deeper levels, we wouldn't say that it's an afflicted mind, because there are those who practice the hearer path, the solitary realizer path, who attain liberation on the basis of cherishing themselves, wanting to achieve their own freedom from suffering and so on. At that very subtle level, we wouldn't say there's an affliction to it. But for most of us, they're coming together. These twin demons are packaged neatly, We have them arising simultaneously in our minds. So this is why, again, we can talk about different modes of apprehension, but nonetheless, they come simultaneously for most of us. So these are the main problem makers. These are the mischief makers that we are trying to execute. So let's go then to the next slide after we talk about the hearts of the enemy, the self. Geshe-la says the enemy, the self, in this particular context is taken to be self-grasping. That is, the ignorance that apprehends the self and all phenomena to be inherently existent. But once more, because it frequently arises with self-cherishing, we wouldn't have a problem saying that, we could include both. But here we are going to include them separately because we're going to talk about the self, which is the main enemy, and the executioner, which is the next slide. The executioner is taken to be self-cherishing, which is likened to a sword-wielding executioner sent by the enemy, self-grasping, to kill us. So you might recall way back in verse 7, I think it was, we talked about the enemy and its messenger, and the messenger was self-grasping, and the enemy was self-cherishing. Here now the enemy is the self-grasping, and the executioner that is sent out by that self-grasping is self-cherishing. So like I said, there's not a consistent way that we look at these two, but nonetheless, the deeper error is the self-grasping. We can get rid of our self-cherishing perhaps a bit easier than we can our self-grasping. But nonetheless, these two, as I said, frequently are coming together. So we are trying to get to the hearts, the modes of apprehension of both of these enemies, the enemy that we call the self-grasping, and the executioner, the one that is sort of sent out by the self-grasping to ruin our happiness by having us follow this self-centered, idea of how we get our happiness for ourselves alone, only being focused on ourselves. So then we have this word maraya that concludes in the next slide. Maraya, this is a Sanskrit word that literally means kill, Geshe-la says. And in some translations, you won't see maraya. You'll simply see kill or mortally strike. The idea being that you want this, you're invoking this force, which again will be our own realizations of cherishing others and the wisdom realizing selflessness that will combat and destroy, annihilate, kill these two demons. Okay? Let's go on then to the next verse, which has more repetition again. Hum, hum, great meditational deity, produce magical emanations. Za, za, bind that enemy under oath. Pei, pei, great Lord of death, please do the liberation right. Destroy, destroy, please cut the knot of grasping. So again, similar ideas once more with the repetition. The first is conventional, the second is ultimate, referring to these two different minds of enlightenment, bodhicitta. that are the two antidotes to the two demons. Great meditational deity is referring to Yamantaka. Produce magical emanations. There's different ways that this is translated. Magical powers, miraculous apparitions, but nonetheless, this is really invoking the idea that we want these two antidotal minds to be developed within ourselves. And it doesn't have anything to do with kind of something outside of ourselves that's going to appear magically and just destroy all this. It has to do with our own cultivation of these different states of mind that will be the antidote, the two minds that cut the knots of self-grasping and self-cherishing, that will actually be able to do that work. So the second line, bind that enemy under oath, kind of, render them immobile, kind of tie them up and make them inoperative in our minds, get rid of the power of those demons to cause harm to us. Don't let them kind of run wild in our own minds. The third line, once more, the great Lord of Death is the executioner of Yama, is the one who kind of destroys death, destroys the cycle of rebirth and so on. So we're invoking once more Yamantaka, which represents the two powers we're trying to cultivate, those conventional and ultimate bodhicitta. Please do the liberation rite. It's just this right against this very enemy. Liberate us from these. Let us not be controlled by these two minds of self-cherishing and self-grasping. Geshe-la in his commentary says the liberation refers to a particular tantra ritual, but he didn't go on to explain it, and I don't know what that refers to. But when we talk about it simply as being what will liberate us from these two states of mind, this is what we want Yamantaka, which once more is the embodiment of these two realizations, to be able to cultivate them in our own minds so we can be liberated from those. Please cut the knot of grasping. Of course, this is the self-grasping, but also the self-cherishing, to cut these two from the root. So, again, very similar ideas. I don't need to probably spend much time on that. We have one more verse before we get into the verses where we have the repetition. Let's go to that one. Come here, great meditational deity, Yamantaka, this sack of actions and the 5 poisonous afflictions that mires us in the foul bog of the actions of cyclic existence. Please, in this very moment, tear it up, tear it to shreds. So this is an interesting little analogy for what cyclic existence is about, is this sort of sack of actions and the 5 poisonous afflictions, this sort of disgusting thing that we're caught up in, that we're mired in, this foul bog of the actions of psychic existence, that this sack of afflictions and actions is kind of within. So it's just referring to cyclic existence, to the state that we are in, where we're under the control of our deluded states of mind, as well as the karma that we create. And so we're once more invoking Yamantaka to help us to be freed from that. Geshe-la says, due to the abodes of psychic existence being completely filled with the foul bog of actions and afflictions, it is likened to a sack. Since the one that mires us in this foul bog is the self-cherishing, we request Yamantaka to tear to shreds this sack of self-cherishing that is completely filled with bad actions and the 5 poisonous afflictions. And the idea behind tearing it up, he says, it's not that you tear it up bit by bit, like little pieces that you're tearing up. You rip the whole thing to shreds immediately. Just like, again, there's a lot of this very forceful kind of violent imagery, because we want the very strong force of these antidotes. So what are the 5 poisonous afflictions? The traditional way that these are set out are in what would kind of be the tantric context, where we talk about these 5 being antidoted by the 5 dhyani Buddhas. And that would be attachment, hatred, ignorance, which we often call the 3 root afflictions, right? And then jealousy and pride would be the other 2. I think there's one text where, it's Tibetan Chodron's, where she says that there's also maybe a sutra presentation where you could call these related to the 5 hindrances to our meditation, our concentration. But again, the traditional texts all relate to these 5 poisonous afflictions of attachment, hatred, ignorance, jealousy, and pride. So these are what poison our minds. These are the main things that poison our minds. Of course, ignorance being the root, the way in which we are apprehending things to exist inherently. So here we want, once more, to annihilate the mind of self-grasping, self-cherishing, to see once more that these two arise in tandem frequently. So any questions up to this point, these verses I've just gone through? This is just once more setting the stage. Yeah, Adam. Wait for the microphone, just 1 second.
I might have missed what the definition of the words hung, zhe,
Za. No. Hung is a syllable that kind of embodies the the perfect wisdom of the Buddhas. Frequently in many meditations you visualize a hung syllable at your heart, which is where the mind is said to be. So you're trying to unite your mind with that perfect wisdom of the Buddhas. I don't know if I've seen any translations of Za or Pei I think Pei is used in a lot of the wrathful mantras and things, but I don't even know what these syllables mean. Does anyone in the room know? I'm deficient in my understanding of a lot of the Sanskrit syllables. Pardon? Yeah, maybe Ja is like the summoning thing. Pei is usually like some type of cutting or something, I think. It's usually got that kind of connotation. Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't really have the exact... And Geshe-la doesn't say the exact... Well, he says... Actually, he does say Pei is to say crush. Crush. That's what he says in his comment. Yeah, Ja means to summon. Oh, there, it's right there. I didn't even see it in the text. Okay, sorry.
And
in
yoga, the bija mantra of the heart chakra is hum, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of these commonalities that kind of both coming from the Sanskrit. So again, hung is kind of invoking that essence of the perfect wisdom of the Buddhas. As Geshe-la says, za means to summon. Pei is to say crush. All right, let's go on then. Again, as I said, from this point on, we have a general outline, which we're going to be following. The first two lines are the distorted ways of thinking and behaving that are due to the twin demons. We can say, again, there's still a strong reference to self-cherishing, but the self-grasping that also is usually accompanying that. And then line CD are the refrain that we saw earlier, right? This idea of rant and rave and so on that we're going to be repeating again and again. So let's go to the next verse, to 55. And, I'm sorry, we've got a little commentary from Venerable Thupten Chodron that I'm sharing. She says, just knowing these verses intellectually isn't sufficient. We need to apply them in our daily lives. In this way, our actions become genuine dharma because it involves transforming our minds from an unwholesome to a wholesome state. So again, this is the whole idea of this text. We don't study it just so that we can, pass an exam or something and have an intellectual knowledge of it. The whole point is to be able to bring this into our lives. To know that at those times when we see these states of mind arising, when we see the various things that we're going to identify in the first two lines as problems, that we know that they're arising from these twin demons and that we do something different, that we actually do something to combat them. So there's some more advice from her, I think, in the next slide. By so clearly pointing out our faults, these teachings encourage us to exercise introspective awareness, to notice these disturbing emotions and actions. Then, instead of justifying or rationalizing them, we can apply their antidotes and be free of them. So, okay. So let's go ahead and read 55 then. Although we have spent our time suffering in the three bad migrations, we run toward its causes without being alarmed, rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So this is very similar to that verse that Radhik brought up yesterday from Master Shantideva, right? I have a version of it written here. For beings long to free themselves from misery, but misery itself they follow and pursue. They long for joy, but in their ignorance destroy it as they would their foe. So this is from the first chapter of Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. It's the same idea that, although we have dealt with suffering since beginningless time, in the bad migrations, even all the suffering that exists in the good migrations, we run towards its causes without any alarm. We just continually go back to the causes of our own suffering again and again and again. So, again, from that point of view of doing this, well, why do we do this? Again, I'm not going to explain the last 2 verses every time we go through this, but it's because of these 2 concepts. It's because of the enemy, the self-grasping, and the executioner, the self-cherishing. So we're once more in each of these verses invoking that idea of cultivating that wisdom, realizing selflessness, as well as the mind cherishing others that we're wanting to cultivate in our own minds to counteract these conceptions that bring about our ruin, that cause us to continue to engage in these patterns of suffering. So this is kind of, again, how the twin demons sabotage our welfare, and so thus we want to do something different. So in the last 2 lines of each of these, we're going to have that similar refrain. Okay? Everybody's kind of seeing then what we're going to be doing. Let's go to the next one. Our effort to accomplish our immediate wishes is small. We do not culminate any of the many activities we do. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So an immediate wish, Geshe-la says, is a wish for something to happen very soon, such as when practicing the Lam Rim, stages of the path, or doing an approximation retreat in Tantra, to desire clairvoyance, visions, and so forth, after not more than 2 or 3 days have passed. So this is kind of an unrealistic expectation, that we're in retreat for 2 days and we want some visions of Manjushri to appear to us or something. It's just not going to happen if we haven't created the causes. And that's because, of course, we aren't culminating those causes. We aren't putting effort into them. We don't, create all of the joyous effort, the enthusiasm to be able to create the causes for that. And once more, as we talked about with karma, if we don't create the causes, we never experience the result. So why don't we experience that result? Why don't we culminate any of the many activities that we do? Why do we get caught up in our laziness, our diversion to other activities, and so on? This is simply because of these 2 states of mind. So we're not doing what's necessary to accomplish our goals, and that's arising because of these levels of ignorance and self-centeredness that we have in our minds. All right, let's go on to the next one. I haven't been pointing out the ones that were on the quiz, but if you are, looking at the quizzes, you'll see that there's a number of these. This one coming up, verse 57, is on the quiz. We have great desire for pleasure, yet do not accumulate the collection of its causes. We have little tolerance for suffering, yet our longing, desire for and covetousness are great. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So this idea of, once more, pleasure and suffering, we saw this a bit yesterday when we talked about the different types of suffering that we should engage in to achieve real pleasure versus the pleasure we follow that only leads to suffering. But we see that this is our fundamental desire, to have pleasure, to avoid suffering, but we do the opposite. Instead of actually understanding and cultivating the causes of happiness and pleasure in this life, we only engage in the opposite, and we have little tolerance for any type of suffering that we experience. But we have great desire, great covetousness, this idea that kind of keeps us moving in that direction where only suffering ensues. So little tolerance for suffering, Geshe-la says, is that whatever studies and so forth we do, whenever a slight difficulty arises, completely lacking in tolerance for suffering, we put it off until later. Great longing desire is that even though we who are presently known for the desire that craves the desirable and so forth, strive out of strong longing for the happiness, wealth, and so forth of this life in the desire realm, we simply do not accomplish them. Great covetousness is, for example, the covetousness in those geshes, lamas, and abbots, for instance, who, whatever studies and so forth they do, are unable to listen and reflect due to lacking tolerance for suffering. So we do see that there's a lot of, tolerance required in the path. We do have to make great effort. We do have to be willing to look at stuff and work on our minds and do the meditations that are involved in helping us to change what we're engaging in. But if we don't have much tolerance for that, if we aren't able to really engage in that level of suffering that leads to true happiness, then we're going to simply get caught up in, again, these patterns that only lead to more suffering, the longing desire, the great covetousness that only causes our own ruin. So again, this one I think is pretty straightforward. Geshe-la points out in regard to that first line, what are the collection of causes that actually result in true happiness and true well-being? Of course, are the 6 perfections. Generosity, morality, patience, joyous effort, concentration, wisdom. Okay. So let's go on then to verse 58. Our new friendships are great, yet our concern for propriety is short-lasting. Our obsessive hunger is strong, yet we steal, rob, and zealously go in search of more. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So the first line is dealing with our relationships, our friendships, and talking about the faults that we have there in regard to our lack of propriety, to make these connections with others, but then to always be looking for, other people, new friendships. We saw this earlier as one of the patterns, that things that we engage in that cause us to have not such reliable friendships. So we see that this is also here, something that arises from these twin demons is, again, our own self-concern that causes this to occur. And then the second line is mostly about our possessions. Our obsessive hunger is strong, and yet we, just continually engage in non-virtue to be satisfying that. So we have a strong obsession for clothing, wealth, and the like. And the cause of this is stealing and robbing others' wealth without, doing the appropriate thing, as we saw earlier, making offerings, being generous, and so on. So we only engage in the non-virtue, and we don't create the causes of virtue that would actually result in our having possessions and so on. So where is all this coming from? What is the cause of all of it? Once more, these twin demons. The first line of the next verse is on the quiz. We'll read that verse. We are skilled in flattery and solicitation, yet our greedy disposition is strong. Although we zealously amass and accumulate, we are bound by miserliness. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So I'm going to read what Geshe-la says on that first line. He says, as explained in the Vinaya, there are 5 wrong means of livelihood. I mentioned these yesterday, I think, because we were looking at deceit and dissimulation, which are a part of this as well. Flattery, which is mentioned here, right? Skilled in flattery. We know what flattery is, to fabricate things about others, say all sorts of wonderful things about them. And in the context of a wrong means of livelihood, that's so that, they become benefactors for us. They do nice things for us, whatever. So this is not a good way to make your livelihood, by kind of telling good things to people that just make them feel good about themselves so that we can get something from them. Solicitation is even though one does not directly beg someone for their wealth and so forth, one explains how having done such and such a right for others was beneficial, how due to having explained this and that dharma, for instance, such and such an offering arose, and so on. It's often what are called, solicitation has different names. It's also called kind of seeking reward for favor. It's like you do, this is the one that's innuendo, this is hinting. This is where you kind of hint at things. You sort of say to somebody, you could do it in worldly ways. Say somebody gave you something really nice for your birthday last year. And so you go up to them and you say, that thing you got me was really, really special. I really like that, that was a really great gift to give me. You're kind of hinting that you want them to do that again or to do something equal again. So we don't want to do that either. We don't want to make these hints to people about how wonderful it was, you did that wonderful thing for me, won't you do it again? I mean, we don't say, won't you do it again, but there's an implication there. That's why it's a bit of like this sort of, you're soliciting it, you're not directly begging for it, but you're trying to get it from them. So those are the two that are singled out here as wrong means of livelihood, that we certainly don't want to engage in, but as it's saying here, we're skilled in those. We're skilled in those and the other wrong means of livelihood. The other three that are set out, besides flattery and solicitation or hinting, is hypocrisy, which we would also call pretension. We talked about that yesterday in relation to one of the verses. Hypocrisy is where we put on airs of being greater than we are. We have a pretension to our pretending to be a great practitioner so that others, will sponsor our retreats for us or things like that. So don't put on those airs. It's not a good way to gain your livelihood or get resources from others. Another one in the footnote is expropriation, which we might also call coercion. Somebody called it artful acquisition. It's where you actually get very crafty in trying to get what you want from others, pressuring them, trying to coerce them into, doing something for you, appropriating their wealth. And it can be quite strong and heavy-handed, and, in our legal systems in various countries, it can become very heavy-handed. Calculated generosity, the last one, is this idea of seeking reward for favor. This is where you're almost like bribing people, and they do this a lot, in some businesses where they offer a small thing, and if you make a large purchase, right? Come buy this, and we'll throw in a coffee maker or something, And so they're always bribing you, trying to get you to do something by offering something small. So this is where, say you've got that person who's been somebody very kind to you, you're throwing small things at them constantly to kind of keep that coming, And it's not to say that if we do have people who are benefactors for us, who do something very kind for us, then we should acknowledge that, but don't do it with these motivations. Don't do it with that, wrong attitude where this becomes, this wrong means of livelihood. So this is why I singled out that one for the quiz, is because it has this, this idea of these 5 wrong livelihoods. But then to have this greedy disposition still is said to be the arisal of a deep-seated hunger that from our innermost heart thinks, since I do not have more than just this tea, butter, and so on, may I receive more. So we engage in these unskillful ways of getting our livelihood, and we keep cultivating the mind that wants more. That is, what's behind those wrong means of livelihood. So, this is just once more speaking to the problems at the mind of self-cherishing. We aren't thinking of others, respecting their resources, respecting them as people, and we're treating them as objects to fulfill our greed. And then it says, although we zealously amass and accumulate, we are bound by miserliness. A similar concept, that except here, it's not just our greediness that wants more, it's our miserliness that keeps us from even sharing what we have. We just want to accumulate stores and stores of wealth and things in our lives, kind of keep them all locked up into ourselves, and we don't, give even the slightest to other beings who need it, or to the 3 jewels. And this is because, once more, of our self-cherishing. So again, we'll go till maybe about 11:15, 11:20, and then we'll have a short break, and then go till the lunch break at 12:30. So let's continue. Okay. Mm-hmm.
How to go about it if you actually notice that someone going over the list here is using very, very, really subtle, but you can still get that they are trying to manipulate you.
Sure.
Do you talk to them back and say, why are you doing this, or you just
I think
don't
again,
say anything?
with any of these situations, it really depends upon the specifics. I mean, if it's somebody who we know quite well and we feel comfortable talking to, we might point it out to them. Might ask them first, I've noticed something about your behavior that I'd like to point out to you, just so that you're aware of it. But are you open to hearing that? I mean, I always feel like and giving any kind of advice, we're really good at giving advice, and we don't really think about whether that person wants to receive advice. So if we're just going to say something without asking even for permission to share that, then I think it could be a problem, because their ears are going to close immediately. And it could even cause a rift with that person. If it's a complete stranger, or somebody that we just have a single interaction with through business or something, well then, we probably don't have the ability to change their minds. We're just somebody who they're encountering in their life, and they wouldn't really care what we think or what we say. And, I mean, this is why in certainly legally there are many things to protect rights of consumers, for example, against some of these abuses that happen that are sort of wrong ways of businesses going about conducting their business. But when it comes to individuals and how they live their lives, well, there's no real kind of rules there, So if it's somebody we have an in with and we feel like they're open to hearing it and we've even gotten permission to share it, well, then share it. But I always feel like I need to ask people before I share things with them, particularly things that are grounded in the dharma that they may not see as wrong at all. Because the world at large may not find a lot of these to be problematic. So there's no set answer to that. I think we just always have to examine it and see who is it, what's our relationship with them, how open are they to it, and what exactly would we say, so we could be very skillful in saying that. And that's a whole other discussion that I don't know that we can go into. All right, let's continue on. All right. We do little for everyone, yet we bemoan the hardships. We lack a sense of responsibility, yet our megalomania is great. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin. To the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So we do little for everyone, and this is like people who are always complaining about how hard they're working, but they're really not doing anything. So, it's kind of like they just want people to feel sorry for them or something. But, we have to, really recognize, are we doing a lot? Are we really fulfilling the responsibilities that we have? Not to just bemoan hardships if we're not really engaging in them. And I don't know if it's such a good idea to bemoan hardships anyway. I fall into this sometimes of just going, how difficult things are or something. But do we really need to do that? If we're really kind of staying true to our goals and what we're doing, nobody needs to hear about our hardships. It's not like we're going to win some kind of medal or something through all the hardships we have to endure. So just, endure what we have to and try to do as much as we can, It's very easy to get overcommitted. I mean, I do this too sometimes where I just, sign up for this and sign up for that and want to help this and want to help that. And I think we have to be very careful about not taking on too much so that we then don't accomplish much for everyone because our energy can't go to all the places we would like to. So I think it's good for us to focus on what is really ideal for us and just do what needs to be done. But this is the opposite, where we aren't doing much and bemoaning our difficulty. Then the second line, we lack a sense of responsibility, yet our megalomania is great. Megalomania could also be translated as kind of the conceit that we're filled with, the delusions of grandeur, even the over-ambition that we sometimes have can take root there. Where once more we kind of, we don't really take responsibility, but we say we will do many things. We give this idea that we're such a great person that will solve all the world's problems or something, and we never take that real responsibility. So both of these have attitudes around, ourselves, what we are able to accomplish, or what our responsibility is, and so we're just trying to overcome that to not create any kind of deceit there too. I think this is a form of deceit when we lead people to believe that we're doing more than we actually are. So, let's go on then to the verse 61. Our acharyas are many, yet our pledges, obligations, and friends are few. Our students are many, yet we benefit and protect them inadequately. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So you have two different perspectives here, and of course, all of us have a different perspective, depending on where we're at. We might not consider ourselves to be Dharma teachers, but nonetheless, we have those people who perhaps do depend upon us to some degree to provide some Dharma in their lives, some advice, teachings. But this is the point of view, first, of us as students, and us looking to our acharyas, our masters, and those people who we learn from, who are guiding us. We have many, which of course, ideally, we should rely upon one or two primarily. I mean, even if we take, many different tantric initiations and have a variety of lamas, I think, again, I mentioned Lama Atisha had 200 some beings that he considered to be his lamas, but there were 3 that he primarily relied upon, his 3 main gurus. We use this term root guru to refer to those beings usually. And people always think, because it's usually singular, I think people wonder, what does that mean? I'm looking for one person that will be my root guru, that will guide me my whole life. Well, I think we can have a number of people, and certainly, sometimes our root guru passes away, and then you've got, a need for another guru. So this is something that I think we can be quite flexible about this idea, but we don't want to necessarily take on too many that we are relying upon. Why? Because it gets to some level of confusion sometimes, where especially if we're seeking advice and we're going to like 4 or 5 different lamas to see what each of them say, and then we say, oh, I'll listen to that one sounds good. Well, then you shouldn't have asked 4 or 5 lamas. You should have asked that one, or trusted in just one person's advice, or trusted in what you believe yourself, if that's what you're going to go by in the end. So we should have a kind of a reliance upon 1 or 2, Geshe-la says, but he says, on the other hand, if we listen to the Dharma from many lamas, we should then guard completely the pure pledges with respect to all of them. We should, pay attention to our obligations, that when we meditate, we should carry the advice of our guru with us all the time. The friends that are mentioned here are the friends in relatives and friends. We should view our lamas to be the best of all friends. So the opposite of that is, having requested many lamas for the Dharma and so forth, to somehow deprecate them, belittle them and the like, without having any other pledges, obligations, or friends. So this is like if we've turned away from what the ideal role of an acharya master is. They're there to guide us, and we can say we have many and boast about it even if we want, but it doesn't do any good if we don't honor that relationship and we don't have any real attention to our pledges, our obligations, and we don't really even consider our lamas to be our dearest friends and follow their advice most importantly. On the other hand, if we are teaching Dharma to others in any way, like I said, it doesn't mean you have to be a formal teacher, teaching people in a setting like this, for example, but every one of us is a teacher to some degree. As we were talking, to Adam's question, teaching through example. We teach through example to many people in our lives. Well, those are the people in our lives, they're there, as we also pointed out in what Adam was saying, because we have a karmic connection with them. Those beings are kind of our students in a sense. Whether we take a formal, guru-disciple relationship or not, that's not the issue. It's like those are people who depend upon us to get the Dharma to some degree. There is that concept sometimes that teachers will say that we have to think about the people in our lives as potentially depending upon us to become enlightened, because we may be the only person that they know who has any link to these teachings. That's one way to think about our goal of becoming enlightened, is being quite specific to the people in our lives whose very enlightenment may depend upon us. Which sounds like a heavy responsibility, but nonetheless, it gives us that force behind what we're doing to really honor those relationships, to take care of them. So here the idea is that you may have many people who rely upon you in that way, yet, you don't protect them, you don't benefit them adequately. Instead, you kind of, once more, through your own self-cherishing, just, do whatever you want to do and don't, pay attention to them. I think it's in Good Karma by Venerable Thupten Chodron that she talks about the challenges of being a teacher and having people call you at all hours and want advice and deal with relationship problems and all the things that people want to know about. But this is part of the job. This is part of being a teacher for others, is that you need to provide that resource, that support. Sometimes even just to be someone who listens to what people are going through. Not that we're always capable of solving others' problems, as we've discussed. Oftentimes we don't have the ability or the skill. But to at least support others through those more difficult times. This is something that, once more, we can see comes from our own self-cherishing, that wants our free time, our rest time, whatever, and doesn't necessarily want to be bothered by other people's problems or difficulties. So I think this one's pretty obvious, too. Talking about it longer probably isn't necessary. Let's go on then to the next one, that is, the first line again is one that I put on the quiz. Our commitments are great, yet our beneficial practice is small. Our reputation is great, yet when examined would embarrass the deities and spirits. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So having taken, Geshe-la says, the individual liberation, pratimoksha, bodhisattva, and tantra vows, through summoning the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas to be our witnesses, we have committed ourselves to protect all the coarse and subtle trainings of these vows, and have promised to achieve Buddhahood for the welfare of all sentient beings, and so forth. Thus, our commitments are very great. I talked about the vows a little bit yesterday. I hope I didn't freak anybody out by talking a little bit about tantric vows. But these vows are we often think of them, I think, in an erroneous way. We think of them as kind of burdens now. I got these vows I have to follow. But we really should think of them as what liberates us from the behavior that is antithetical to our path. It's like it narrows exactly the path we need to follow. So we know we need not pay attention to anything on the wayside. The path is very clearly laid out. The path to individual liberation through the lay vows, and of course monastic vows that are in that vein as well. The path to enlightenment through the bodhisattva vows, and the path to quick enlightenment through the tantric vows. So we should see them as like a great blessing. They're like giving us boundaries to our behavior, telling us exactly where we need to go. So if we take on these commitments, there's an obligation. So we have to make sure that we fulfill that. He says, however, through separating from and dropping all the pledges that are to be guarded, we do not show even a little bit of practice that would be of definite benefit to ourselves and others. Again, maybe we're not at that extreme where we don't show even a little bit of practice, but we have to live up to that obligation, always trying to do our best to fulfill the commitments that we have, the vows that we have. I was talking with one student recently about the commitments that we make as part of tantric empowerments in particular, where you've got a mantra commitment or a practice commitment, and how important it is to honor those. And I know there are times in people's lives where it's very hard to keep up with all of the commitments, especially if you have a lot of them. But that, to me, and this is just my own personal feeling, I feel like that's the bottom line. If I at least do those every day, maybe I don't have hours to meditate or do other things, at least do those. When I'm traveling or whatever, that's so important. That's just really necessary to just kind of maintain that. Because there's a continuity that you don't want to break with those commitments. The day in, day out, always maintaining that I think is really, really important. And again, we see, why don't we do it? Because of our self-cherishing mind frequently. Sure, there are times when maybe our lives are quite overwhelming, but I think we have to have that bottom line of what it is that we really need to do every day. Our reputation is great, yet when examined would embarrass the deities and spirits. Again, this is something that, once more, are we living up to how we are perceived? Hopefully we don't get getting attached to a reputation. This, once more, is one of our 8 worldly dharmas. But if our behavior were to be examined in the light of whatever our reputation is, would it embarrass these beings, or would it actually be something they could see some truth to, that actually the external reputation is in line with who we are internally? So, good enough on that one. Let's move on to 63. The extent of our hearing is small, yet our boastful empty talk is great. The extent of our scriptural knowledge is small, yet we have realized all that is not yet realized. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So these both have to do with kind of our Dharma knowledge, the hearing that we've engaged in. As we saw yesterday, the wisdom of hearing is the initial taking in of the Dharma through going to teachings, reading, listening to teachings on YouTube, whatever, wherever you're getting teachings of the Dharma from. If the extent of your hearing is small and yet you're boasting of having such great knowledge and whatever, it's a lot of empty talk. So this, again, make sure that everything's in line. In fact, there's no need to boast about it, even if you did have great hearing, even if you did have great realizations. The second line, the extent of our scriptural knowledge is small. This last part is meant to be a bit of a joke, yet we have realized all that is not yet realized. It's like for somebody to say that, oh, I have great realizations, oh, I've realized emptiness, oh, whatever, completion stage, no problem, I'm already, almost a Buddha. So, this is obviously something that is not in accord with reality, so we need to be very careful. Once more, this is a form of hypocrisy, of pretension. Geshe-la says, in addition, when someone has the highest degree of hearing and thinking, it is not possible for them to be devoid of scriptural knowledge and logical reasoning. However, when those who are devoid of scriptural knowledge and logical reasoning, by the force of lacking that, explain the Dharma and so forth to others, they trick others by means of various lies about their having realized that which they have not yet realized. And he says this could be also while one does not have even a single scrap of excellent knowledge concerning the Dharma of the various lineages and so on, to pretend in others' perspective to be expert in all of them. Bless you. So any pretension that we have, or any kind of ways that we deceive others into thinking that we have skills beyond what we possess, due to self-cherishing, self-grasping. So let's go on then to the next verse. Like I said, I'm going to try to keep moving through these somewhat quickly. Our servants are many, yet none of them takes any responsibility. Our masters are many, yet we are without a supporter and protector. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So we have our servants back again. All our many servants, who bring us tea and everything. This is, again, can be any companions that we have, but we would say this is more those who are on an equal or subservient level, those who we are in a superior position to. We might have many people in our lives who play some role in helping us through their actions, through their support and so on at that level, but none of them take any responsibility, So this is a bit, it's kind of an interesting one, because it seems like this is almost back to the other verses where we're looking at karmic results, right? Things that we have in our lives. But, this is just indicating that we still can have these that are kind of attributable to the self-cherishing and the self-grasping. So it says here, none of these are dependable then. None of these people in our lives have dedication. And where the people who are in a superior position to us, our masters, are many, yet we are without a supporter and a protector, without any kind of guardian, anyone to attend to, protecting us from harm and what have you. So as I said, this is a bit more in the vein of what we looked at as these karmic results, but this is a pattern that we can certainly see in our lives, that we have many people who play different roles to us, but we don't take the initiative to help them to fulfill their obligations to us, or to kind of be supporting of us. On this other hand, to depend upon others, certainly we can't live independently. We know this. There's an interdependence in everything that we do, but there's a quote from Reting Rinpoche that's in Geshe Ngawang Dargye's commentary. He said, "Never place any expectations in human beings. Trust the three jewels alone." So I don't know, that's pretty strong advice, but this isn't to say, again, that we neglect others or we don't acknowledge when they do things for us. This is, again, the karma that we would have to help others to be more responsible and to be involved in our lives, is to always have gratitude for that, to always be taking care of others, whether they are in a superior position to us or an inferior position to us, to make sure that we are doing what we can to honor those relationships. So again, this one is a little strange in terms of it looking more like a result, but we are moving into that area where we are continuing to, this is coming up on session 9, by the way, which is where ideally I would have started at 10 o'clock. So we're not doing too bad. So this one, again, is a little bit different, but let's go on then to let's take our break. It's 11:20 or so. We'll follow that clock up there, 11:20. So let's take about, again, 11:35. We'll be back in here, 15 minutes. And then we'll go till 12:30. Okay.